Hello, online congregation. This is Matthias G. Vollmer, pastor to you and yours, coming at you to talk about sanctification. You want to be sanctified? For 3 easy payments of $17.77, God's number's in there, you can get one of these genuine prayer cloths, send it home, it's prayed over, it's got a little sweat on it, and you can be sanctified too. We got all sorts of colors, all shapes and sizes. 3 easy payments of $17.77. And if you act today, you'll get one of these genuine Bibles signed by me. Well, not that one, but call today, get the Lord, and call and act sanctification through a prayer cloth. We'll see you.
Mom, you won't even believe it. I have the lifetime deal. It's a deal of a lifetime. Yeah, it's about a prayer cloth that gets me into heaven. Mom, no, it's not a scam. I just need the 3 numbers on the back of the card. I got it! It's here! Oh my gosh, it's here! I can't believe it's here! Yes, I get to go to heaven! Heaven for you, and you, and you, and heaven for you. You can go to heaven, little Maddie.
What are you doing?
I'm sanctifying you so you can go to heaven.
I don't think that's how that works, buddy.
It's not?
Why don't you tell us, Ross?
Sounds like a plan. Wish we had little Maddie up here on stage. A good skit indeed. Well, as we continue the sermon series on being a kingdom influencer, on evangelism essentially, I thought it appropriate that we turn to Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. That's Galatians 4. Well, if you're a young adult and want to join our study on the fruit of the Spirit, I'll be teaching on that on Wednesday nights. But today, here we are. We are indeed in Matthew 13. Verse 1 through 3 says this: That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables. Note that the chapter starts off saying that same day, and what has Jesus just done? He has taught, he has healed, and so here, at this point in the gospel, Jesus is at sort of the top of his notoriety. And crowds are beginning to gather around him more and more, and we know that Jesus sets up his teachings like this all the time. For instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, he goes to the mountain and begins to teach. And we know, scholars say, that it is easier without modern technology to speak to as many people as possible while on a mountain, either talking down at them or in an amphitheater style, standing below the people and speaking up at them. And similarly, if you've ever gone sailing or if you grew up on the water, you know that voices actually carry over water more. I knew this intuitively. I grew up sailing. I wasn't very good at it. I did more swimming than sailing, but I wondered why this is, and so I decided to look it up, and apparently most of the time, water is colder than the air temperature, making the air that's just over it denser, so that there's more air vibrating. We know that in a vacuum, sound doesn't carry, because there's nothing vibrating to carry it, and there's more air carrying it, therefore voices carry more. And the only reason I point this out is because Jesus could have obviously miraculously made his voice boom. He could have spoken directly into the crowd's head. But I can't get out of my mind the image that, because we know Jesus is present at the beginning of creation. I can't get out of my head the image as he is weaving together the laws of physics, the idea of like, I'm going to use that later. Right? And so I just think God is smart, I guess. This is the start of many farming parables, and therefore starting with the parable of someone sowing seeds makes a lot of sense. A little note about the structure of this sermon: we're going to handle the parable, which is from 1 through 9, and then there's a break from 10 to 17 as Jesus explains teaching in parables just in general. And then it picks back up with the parable of the sower in 18 through 23. So we will handle that median, but I'm going to handle verses 4 and 19, then 5 and 6 and 20 and 21. We're going to handle the parable and its explanation as one unit, and then we'll handle that middle part as its own unit. But first, let us read through the rest. Verse 4 goes on to say, "And as the sower sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." And then 18 picks up and says, "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and yet it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another case 60, and in another 30. A good word indeed. Well, verse 4, the seeds that fell on the path. And we know that Jesus says that birds come and pick up the seeds, and then in his explanation, the bird is the enemy. And it's very important to pay attention to verses 4, and the explanation for verse 4 is verse 19, because Jesus is letting us know a place where the enemy will be active. You have heard it said before, and I will say again, it is very important to have a properly sized scope of the work of Satan, because too often do we err in one direction or another. Especially here in the United States, often we make this error. That, we make this error. Some people think that the enemy is simply a metaphor for sin in general, or that maybe the enemy exists, but, he does work over there. Don't really see his work around me at all. And we know this is an error. We know biblically this is an error. Why? Because Jesus is warning that the enemy will be at work. We can also make an error in the other direction, though. Perhaps some of you have met believers like this who blame everything on Satan, forgetting about things like free will, forgetting about things like original sin and consequences for your own actions, thinking that every single thing is the enemy, always praying against the enemy. And both of these scopes are biblical, where the proper scope is this: he will be active in some places. And it's important to listen to Jesus when he tells us that the last thing that Satan wants is for there to be more Christians. So as you are going and sowing, be aware of that. Something that I have learned from excellent prayers at this church is a prayer to bind the enemy. I hear that often in our staff prayers, in other prayers around this church, prayers for healing when people are in dire situations. I've learned this language of Lord, bind Satan in this circumstance. And why do I think that's a good prayer? Two reasons. One, it taps into a truth that is already true. God is already limiting the scope of what the enemy can do. We know this in Job, right? And it taps into what will come. We know that the binding of the enemy will be complete, right, as described in Revelation. So it's a very biblical prayer. It's one that I've learned here, and it's good because it keeps the right scope of the enemy, because even after that prayer is prayed, there is more prayer yet. Look at these words. What is sown in the heart. This is verse 19, if I can find it. It's in here. Hold on. There we go. When anyone who hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. We are tempted sometimes to think that people reject the word of the kingdom because they did not understand. But Understanding has a deeper meaning here, and we'll get into that at the end. It is possible, however, unfortunately, to really get what it's about, to really get the word of the kingdom and still reject it. We know this to be true. We know, frankly, that saying no to God is a real option. It's a horrible option. But in his goodness, it is a real option. So do not always chalk up rejection of God to misunderstanding of God. We have to understand and choose. Verse 5 says, other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, but since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Jesus explains what this means in verse 20. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. And the first thing that, frankly, I thought of after reading that passage was last week's bumper video, the skit of the YouTubers, the travel YouTubers coming through and touring St. Matthew and having a good time and being really excited about it and all of the wonderful things we do here, and coming out of the church and going, well, that was fun, being joyful about it, but asking themselves, well, what is it they really do there? And of course, Jake walks by behind them and says, guys, it's about Jesus. Even Jake knows that, right? And I love you, Jake. And that sounds a lot like what Jesus is describing here. An immediate, joyful response. But if you are not rooted in the word of the kingdom, then you are susceptible to you're susceptible to a lack of durability. Because Jesus says when trouble or persecution arise on what? On account of the word. That's not separate. Life isn't hard apart from our faith, but we know this to be true. There are aspects of our faith in which life gets more difficult. And if you decide to take on this faith, Jesus says that following him costs something, right? The bid of the gospel is a bid to come and die to yourself, right? Pick up your cross and follow Jesus. It costs something. And sometimes when people discover that, if they are not rooted, they are easily uprooted. The other not so subtle but extremely profound thing about 5 and 6, about this part of the parable, is that persecution on account of the word, trouble and persecution on account of the word, is likened to what? What is it in the metaphor? It's sunlight, which is what makes plants grow. Therefore, Jesus is letting us know that the same mechanism by which this world will attempt to whittle away at your faith, God can redeem and use to strengthen it. It's going to look the same, but your response to it is what matters. That for some reason, somehow, because God is God and he can redeem and he can remake, trouble and persecution can be as sunlight, either scorching to the poorly rooted seed, or nurturing and growing to the one that is rooted. Verse 7 goes on. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew and choked them. And its explanation is similarly short. As for what was, in verse 22, as for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. See, here again, we have an example, evidence-based, to have a right-sized enemy, because the enemy is not the reason why all of these seeds do not grow. It can be the reason. It's the reason that Jesus leads with, but here is a counterexample. So if we think that the enemy is doing it all, we'd be wrong. And if we think that the enemy is doing nothing, we'd be wrong again. So another note to have a right-sized view of the power of the enemy. Another thing that pops out to me here is that we are always being formed by something. In my Wednesday night class, we're doing spiritual formation, and we've picked a curriculum that someone else has written. It's really good. And part of their thesis, part of the main point is this, that there is no neutral state of being. There is nothing you can do that will be neutral to you. It will either form or deform you. There is no seed that simply sits and waits and might go to church in a couple months when it gets convenient or when work isn't so busy. That's not neutral. It is deforming to the person. And also we see this, that the word of the kingdom is in opposition to worldly treasure, right? To the wealth of the world. Jesus describes it as a lure. It is dangerous. It looks like you want it, but if you take it, it will take you farther than you want to go. And verse 22 pivots us to the point of the parable being yield. He notes that all of these other things yield nothing. And before we get into the wonderful goodness of 8 and 23, let us now handle 10 through 17, the section that seems to cut this parable in half, because Jesus gives the parable, then does 10 through 17, explaining parables in general, and then explains the parable that he just said. 10 through 17 says this: after he is given this parable, then the disciples came and asked him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" He answered, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to those who have more will be given. For to those, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them it is indeed fulfilled, the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen but never understand, and you will indeed look but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn. I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Why does Jesus give this clarification in the middle of the parable? Well, quite frankly, he's explaining what he's doing. All of these crowds have gathered, and we know that many people to this day look to Jesus for what they can get out of him. And given the context of 13, these crowds are gathering not just because of his teachings, but also because of his healings. And so it is very much possible that people are not understanding who Jesus is proclaiming to be, right? What he's talking about is the word of the kingdom. 10 through 17 can look really scary, and a lot of people, a lot of churches, quite frankly, see predestination in this. See, either you're in or you're out, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I'll look to Matthew 13, 10 through 17 to prove this, forgetting that it starts with this. Then the disciples came and asked, and then he says to the disciples, to you it has been given. And we know at the end of this gospel that it is possible to make disciples. Therefore, this is not a proclamation of some people are in, some people are out. It is a declaration saying that if you want to get it, it's going to take focus. But it is possible to be made, to be formed into a disciple. And if you are, then you will have eyes to see. Then you will have ears to hear. And he talks about the prophets not seeing. Well, the prophets were talking about the Messiah, and there he was. So indeed, the disciples got to see something that others had wished to see. And with that as the backdrop, finally we get to the wonderful 8 and 23. Other seeds fell on good soil, and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. See that at the end of 9, and then look back at verse 3. He told them many things in parables, saying, listen. And then he finishes the parable in verse 9. Let anyone with ears listen. God is telling you to pay attention to this one. Why? Because it's about understanding the word of the kingdom. What is the word of the kingdom? It is a proclamation of dominion, right? Jesus is here and Jesus reigns. How are you going to respond to Jesus reigning? How are you going to respond to the right king being on the throne? Will you resist it? Will you not understand it? Will you not listen to him? That is the word of the kingdom. It's both here and not yet. Look, there's still mystery on the table when we're trying to define what is the word of the kingdom. But immediately, it is Jesus' domain, and whether you rebel against it or submit to it. With Jesus, this is our first note. I know it's taken a while to get here. With Jesus, understanding implies doing. Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount with what? With this. Anyone who hears his words and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house upon the rock. So there is not an understanding where there is not doing. That's the important thing. The other thing is this, and this is the crux of the sermon. Evangelism and identity are inexorably bound. Why? Because the driver of abundance in the parable of the sower does not come from the mere sowing. It comes from the understanding. It comes from the good soil. Therefore, if we want to be a kingdom influencer, if we want to disseminate the word of the kingdom, our understanding must mean doing, as Jesus has asked us to do. And our understanding of God's dominion is then what drives multiplication, not the sowing. It wasn't the seeds that fell anywhere else, but the seeds that fell on good soil, those who understood. What then are we to do? A good parable indeed, and perhaps we can all think of examples in our lives of people that we have met that fall into different categories that Jesus is talking about. Well, a few things stand out. One, the message today is the same. The same seed is sown across all these different circumstances. And I think that's important, especially today, because too often do churches sometimes want to water down or modify the gospel to make it more seeker-friendly, right? Or frankly, in our social circles, are we tempted to not speak about Jesus as radically as we ought to? Maybe not even out of social anxiety, but thinking if we modify the word a little bit, maybe this person will then come or understand. And yet here in this parable, the same seed is sown across all of these circumstances. Another thing to think, when you're thinking of a person and you're thinking about sharing the gospel with them, being loving towards them, you might be thinking, there's something I need to say. And that's probably true. But the parable of the sower lets us know that multiplication comes from our understanding, and we know that understanding means doing. So don't just think, there is something I need to say to this person. Also think to yourself, there is someone I need to be to this person. And multiplication will flow from that as well. These things are not contrasted with another, but they are in concert to another, right? Give authority to you yourself sharing the word of the kingdom by living it out. Simple in principle, difficult in practice, so we should all try together in order to achieve it. This parable, the sower can either be Jesus or it can be the disciples. Likely what's at the front of the mind is Jesus because he's describing what he is doing. There's a large crowd, he's giving lessons, some people are getting it, some people aren't. It's immediately what he's doing in the context. But we know that we are meant to be like Jesus, and part of the takeaway is similar to 1 John, right? We are not meant to be surprised, brothers and sisters, when the world hates you, right, on account of Christ. And Jesus, through this parable, is letting us know, not only, like if you're being sown, let's say that you're the soil, understand and do, that's where the multiplication comes from. But as you are made into a disciple, as you go and make disciples, and you look more like Jesus, and you begin to take the role of the sower, do not get discouraged. Because even as Jesus taught, some people got it and some people did not get it. And I think we might be tempted if we share the gospel and don't have, and obviously this is erroneous thought, and we don't have a 100% success rate sharing Jesus, we think that there's a problem with us, when instead Scripture lets us know that no, not everyone's going to get it. Sometimes the seed falls on rocky soil. Sometimes the world hates you. Sometimes you have to get up, dust off your sandals, and go on. Why? Because it's possible to truly and accurately present the gospel, and it is possible to say no to God. And Jesus is letting his disciples know, don't get discouraged, don't be surprised, because when it does fall on good soil, the multiplication is to such a degree that these other things, the seeds, frankly, that do not bear fruit, sort of fall into the periphery to 100-fold, to 60, to 30. Sending starts with who Jesus is. This is our last note. The Great Commission at the end of this gospel, Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples," right? And too often do we start with the go therefore, forgetting that there's a therefore, meaning that there's an idea coming before it. All of that sending, the making of disciples, the baptizing, the teaching, starts with what? With Jesus saying, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." That is the word of the kingdom. What kingdom? God's kingdom. What God? Jesus Christ. Evangelism and identity are so bound because we will not successfully evangelize. We will not successfully be a kingdom influencer, the kingdom that we are trying to influence to have greater influence, being God's kingdom, if we don't understand it as God's kingdom. What God? Jesus Christ. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. Therefore we go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that he has taught us, and knowing, if we have an accurate understanding of the kingdom, that he isn't really gone, but that he is with us until the end of this age. So let us remember that as we go and we share. And as you go into your week, think about whose kingdom you are in and how we ought to respond to that. Thank you very much. Hmm?